Welcome to Cybersecurity Refined and Feral, where refinement meets chaos in the digital world. We invite you to join your co-hosts Candy Alexander and Cailin Sullivan in another open conversation on topics related to cybersecurity.
Hi everybody, welcome to Cybersecurity Refined and Feral. I'm Cailin Sullivan.
And I'm Candy Alexander. Today we have a really special guest. I'd like to introduce you to Ross Young, who has been around for a while now, who is very much a community-minded professional. Ross, you are always out on LinkedIn giving advice, really solid advice. So welcome in, and please introduce yourself if you would, please.
Yeah, thank you. It's been my pleasure. So I've been in cybersecurity for about 20 years. I spent 10 and a half years at the Central Intelligence Agency. I also worked at Capital One. I was the CISO of Caterpillar Financial. I've done a podcast for 5 years called CISO Tradecraft, and just super excited to help people on their cybersecurity journey. I know how hard it was for me to kind of find good mentors and learn. And so I think it's really important that we all give back and help our industry.
Absolutely. Thank you for that. And thank you for all you do, by the way. I think that's what I strive for in our community, because it is a community, to help each other and lift each other up and encourage each other. So again, thank you for joining us today. So today, I wanted to talk about third-party risk management. You had made a post a little bit ago about the Clorox breach. And I thought it was really interesting. And you positioned it that third-party risk management needs to go beyond what we're doing today. In other words, we're doing the trust, but not the verification. Before we even get into that, I just wanted to share, I was shocked when I read that article that you had linked, because, cut to the chase, it was an outsourced help desk, IT help desk, that had changed the password, if you will, for somebody to get into privileged accounts. Just so you know, it is that attack vector that was maybe 40 years ago that caused me to get in. And if we all remember a gentleman by the name of Kevin Mitnick,
Yeah.
got into Digital Equipment Corporation with that same ploy by calling the help center or the help desk up at Bitbrook Engineering, and he got in that way. So after all these years, number one, why didn't we get that fixed? And number two, why in goodness name would we not check out the verification of the security systems for our supply chain? So why don't you give us a little more color as to what your thoughts are and what your, what came to mind right away when you saw that article?
Yeah, so third-party risk management or third-party vendor management, I personally think is probably the most broken thing in cybersecurity. And if anybody doesn't know the process, let me just give a quick background on it. It looks something like this. Hey, I want you to be my vendor. Cool. Now, in order for you to be my vendor, you're going to have to pass a series of questionnaires that I'm going to give to you. First thing is I'm going to give you something like the Cloud Security Alliance Control Assessment Initiatives Questionnaire, or CAIQ. And you're going to fill out 300 questions about how your company does XYZ. I'm going to ask for a SOC 2 or an ISO 27000 attestation. You're going to provide me that. I'm also going to ask for recent pen tests and some security policies. And then I'm going to maybe scan you with something like a BitSight or security scorecard. After I get all of that information, I'm going to make some risk-based judgment about your company, about are you secure enough but for me to put my customers' PII data on your systems. The problem is this has really come from auditors and hasn't really come from real world hackers and pen testers for, is this going to work? And I'll just give you a very clear example. If we were to go and say, let's analyze every company that had a major breach during 2024, let's look for some trends, right? We might find that social engineering was very popular. Places like MGM And, some of the large casinos in Vegas had this issue when somebody called their help desk, got the creds to reset an account, and then they were in, right? That's probably not something I'm going to find in any of these due diligence questionnaires when I do my third-party risk management. So ultimately, it is a compliance checklist and a lot of busy work instead of actually going back to what are the real threats we need to stop, and how do I ask those questions in order to secure my organization?
Right.
Yeah,
Absolutely.
I would, from my own personal experience, I feel like a lot of people that send us and my company these questionnaires don't necessarily understand what it is that they're trying to evaluate with them. 'Cause, for the most of the time, I would evaluate us as a low risk. But some of these customers, they don't treat different vendors with different risk profiles. Everybody's treated like a critical vendor.
Yeah, and it's very different because if I host all of my data in SaaS applications, right, it's probably very different than if I wrote custom code applications for every one of my services, right? Because if I'm using everything in a CRM tool that's built by ServiceNow or HubSpot, chances are the security behind that solution is pretty good because they don't just put out terrible quality products that haven't gone through security reviews at those companies. And so if I'm using the standard forms and functions, I'm probably pretty safe. Not 100% perfect, but you're mostly there. Versus if I wrote custom Java code, there's all sorts of ways I could have put bad things in because I didn't run different scans, didn't put it behind a web application firewall, and all those things that come with being a very large, mature company, right? When I am a team of 5 developers, I'm just getting something out of the door so we can survive as a business. I may not have done all the security requirements that you can do at a company where you have a lot more maturity.
Well, I'm glad you brought that up. And I do want to hit on the maturity aspect, but as well, the criticality aspect that Cailin might have hinted to. For example, it seems like when we get organizations, that's if we can get, goes to the maturity perspective, if we can get the organization to adopt a solid third-party risk management or vendor management program, then that's great. But not all companies will even do that. It's just, unfortunately, it's a means to the end of getting people to sign the contract, simply put. But I think the other aspect is not really recognizing the criticality of the use case in which you're having the vendor or the third party complement your services. So it's one thing to have them, do something like a teaching aid, right? That's layered on top of your application. It's not touching your application. It's not touching your data. It's just an overlay. So that's really minimal impact or risk to the data or the organization, as opposed to, like you said, well, I got my CRM in, Salesforce or something like that. That's a whole different level of, risk from a, use case perspective. So I think, there's 2 examples, right, that I think are broken in our system. The criticality of the use case, not just this, application, but looking at it from a use case perspective, and then getting organizations to really pay attention, like you said, from a risk perspective. I mean, that's part of the name, right?
Yeah. I think the biggest problem today is the incentives are misaligned. So right now, the incentives of a company who's a software vendor is sell their software and then get a signed contract and move on to the next customer that they're going to sell to. And I don't think that really supports the customer from a long-term perspective. So for example, if I've locked into a 3-year deal with an XYZ vendor, and all of a sudden I scan their system and I find here's a bunch of high and critical vulnerabilities, what incentive do they have to go fix that for me?
Right.
They already got my money. I'm in a contract for 3 years. There's not a lot of incentive. And I think that's the problem. So one of the things that I'm actually recommending to companies is say, we need to change our contracts and we need to make this incentive driven. For example, let's just say we want 0 higher critical vulnerabilities on a system to be older than 30 days as an SLA, like we might normally have for patching. I might try to put an incentive structure in there that says, hey, we're going to actually look for vulnerabilities on your bug bounty program that are publicly, listed out there and how long it takes you to respond. And so if I log into a website like HackerOne and I can see that you're, triaging and fixing vulnerabilities in, 17 days, perfect. I'm going to give you a $10,000 bonus every single month that you do that. But guess what? If all of a sudden, you're at 90 days, you're not going to get that bonus for that month.
Mm-hmm.
And so now these companies, when they start to see that, oh my goodness, we can actually make an extra $120,000 on this contract if we just do our patching correctly and get this timely fixed. Wow, we could actually dedicate a headcount to that and fix it. And what if it's not just one company, we actually form a syndicate of 10 companies?
Mm-hmm.
And now it's not $120K, it's $1.2 million on the table to make sure this system is well patched and well hardened. I think we end up with a better outcome for both the customers and the seller of the software is like, wow, I can make 1.2 million on this thing. So now I can actually carve out the business line item to have dedicated security people to maintain that tool.
Yeah.
Things like this are not typically in contracts today, but if we get it there, I think now we get to the right type of third-party incentive programs for companies.
I absolutely love that. That's brilliant. It really is brilliant because it also speaks to, we talked about motivation and incentive and that, money. That's why businesses are in business, to make money. So that really is an alignment or makes an alignment from the cyber risk perspective to, reduce that risk in order to get, additional revenue. What CFO, what CEO wouldn't understand that? It's very understandable as opposed to, geez, we've got our security team out flat answering all these security questionnaires that are taking forever. They're not able to focus on other things that are important from the security perspective, but we are having that be their priority because we need to close deals. We need to get the rev gen in, right? So it becomes a deterrent in the model that we have today. And what you just expressed is most certainly it supports revenue generation. Again, that's why businesses are in business.
Yeah, and completely look at it, what does it take a company to be there? If you have a bug bounty program where anybody can find vulnerabilities and you're fixing that in a very timely manner, you probably have a really good program. Yeah. I don't need to read your security policy about patching if I see it real world, implementation working as desired. Because you can all have a policy that says, yeah, we do everything perfect and do crap and it's terrible for me. But I want to see this evidence or outcome-based results. And I think when we start to do this, this is when we elevate our third-party risk management program to be really, really good.
That's really revolutionary. I'm sorry to say that's like unheard of today. But it's brilliant. I would love to see that adopted. But we're so steadfast into the audit mentality. And let's face it, anybody, whether it's a financial audit or a cybersecurity audit, IT controls audit, whatever audit to me means a point in time, period. And let's face it, we've all worked and we all know those organizations that are like, oh my gosh, we got to get ready for our SOC 2. They tighten up the belt. And as soon as the observation's over, they loosen the belt and it's like, all right, back to work, right?
And the dirty secret is if you actually start to look at the standards and say what is required, it's actually pretty bad, right? It'll say, do you have an asset management vulnerability program? Yeah, we can figure out our assets, but it's not accurate. Mm-hmm. We have a vulnerability management program we're patching in 300 days. Those sorts of things still pass those audits, right? It doesn't mean they're any good. It means you just did what you said you did poorly.
Right.
And so I think that's the problem here. We have these standards that are not very good. We're paying thousands of dollars to big accounting firms to assess us and give an external attestation, but it's not worth the paper it's printed on because the controls are bad that we're testing.
But isn't that on the business to make sure that your controls are actually being worded correctly and in a way that supports security initiatives? I think that's by company.
Well, not really, because the controls come back to the standard ISO 27000, or they come back to the SOC 2. So it's not like the company can really change the controls. It's the same controls if you want to have that exact attestation. And that's the problem, is those controls I don't think are very, very good. Right. I'd like to see a control that says, show me if we looked at your vuln management scanning, the average age of your vulns is less than 30 days. We don't get anything like that in these attestation controls today. We just get, hey, do you have a vuln management program that's being reviewed on a frequent basis? And then all they have to do is say, oh, we sent a report to a CIO once a month. And that checks that box. Doesn't matter how good or bad the vulns are, right?
Or how good, bad the report is. So it brings to mind too, when I first started working with a federal contractor, FISMA, right? If you remember that. So that was a groundbreaking requirement for federal contractors to, comply to NIST SB 853. And do classification systems. And that's really impressive. And it was painful. I loved it. It read like a family, Bible to me. But if you recall, when it first came out, you just needed to comply with the controls. And then probably 3 to 5 years into that program, then it became active monitoring. So it wasn't a matter, did you pass your, your assessment and get your, authorization to operate, same thing as the attestation, letter of attestation. So all of that did originally follow the auditor checklist mentality, but quickly the federal government, U.S. federal government realized, this needs to be an ongoing monitoring schema. Is that something that could possibly happen in the future with programs such as SOC 2 or with ISO?
So I think you're hinting on a really important point here. The first is compliance actually does improve security. There's a lot of bad compliance that takes time and effort and resources on the wrong things, but ultimately, most of it is good things. We want access controls to make sure people have legitimate justification and access to a system. Yeah, that's something we all probably want. We want this zero trust approach, these types of things. The two pieces here that I have to always call out are, first, when was this standard written? Right? So if I have a standard from, let's call it 2002, like I think that's when SOX came out, there was no mobile phones. There was no cloud. There was no AI, agents, MCP servers going around. There was no generative AI. So the guidance it gave, while may have been perfect at its time,
right,
have we updated that law since 2002? And mostly the answer is no. We never actually go and make sure those laws get updated every year. And that's the first problem, is we end up doing all of this busy work on things that aren't as important. So maybe back in 2002, I was really worried about USB drives being plugged into laptops. I was really worried about unencrypted laptops. But now it's really easy to lock down USBs on all devices. It's really easy to have, default encryption on any endpoint. So those aren't really big things, but I still spend time on that. So I think that's the first thing, is we have a lot of regulation that's legacy and doesn't get yearly updates. The second thing that I would also say is the attack vectors change so fast. And if I'm spending my time and resources doing all this mandatory compliance from 2002, I lose my ability and resources to focus on the 2025 risks. And I'll just give you an example. Let's say my organization today is allowing customers to upload data into our web application. And our web application is smart. We've trained it with AI to analyze the images, to look for character recognition and things in there. So historically, I might have just scanned an image for malware. But now, what happens if it's actually giving malicious commands to my AI to understand that image, and it's saying, hey, actually send your sensitive data to this email address?
Mm-hmm.
Well, that's a risk I should probably be thinking about when I start having these new AI capabilities that I'm not going to find in any standard from 2002 because that technology didn't exist. And so I think we have to also really take a look at how do we make sure we have an evolving standard that doesn't become 10,000 controls I have to satisfy. I'd rather do 20 controls amazingly well, and those change year to year, than have to do 3,000, 10,000 controls poorly because I don't have enough time and effort to focus on them in enough depth.
That's interesting. And I appreciate very much that, right? Because I mean, let's face it. I mean, threat intelligence is absolutely huge. It's a big part of our market today, and it's necessary to understand, right? But I think that having the basics in regards to controls is important as well. Perhaps not go into the detail. I mean, we could get into the old password, the value of a password versus a passphrase versus multi-factor versus biometrics and blah, blah, blah. But ultimately, it falls under access control, right? And authentication and authorization. The basics. These are the basics, Ross, that, the three of us have learned, authorization, authentication, and look at it from that perspective. So I think I wouldn't dismiss necessarily the basics. I just actually posted about, I think Rock Lambos had a post about AI, and it's like everything you said is the basics. So let's not throw the baby out with the bathwater. Let's just make sure the bathwater is changed and updated, if you will. So, and I know like NIST puts a lot of effort into updating their standards as well as ISO. Does it happen as frequently? No. So maybe looking at having like a 5-year attestation of do you meet the, whatever 100 and whatever controls and pick one, and then have a yearly assessment on the top 20 vulnerabilities. That speaks to the risk, as well as, are you a responsible, we talk about responsibility a lot with AI and whatnot. Are you a responsible organization? Trustworthy systems. Remember that from back in the day. So I don't know what the answer is other than I agree it's outdated. And I would also offer, and I'm sorry I'm going all over the place, but also offer to Cailin's point that the people that are responsible for the risk, third-party risk process aren't even security people. So they don't know what they're asking for. I mean, how many times have, the three of us been into what is it that they're really looking to understand? What is the risk they're looking to uncover? What do you think?
Yeah, just on that point, I think that's something. I'll tell you, I kind of disagree with our industry a little bit. So if you take a look at like the SOC 2 Type 2 report, has to be signed off and done by a CPA, right? Not a cyber practitioner at all. So you're telling me if I spent 20 years in pen testing and GRC and know everything about all the controls, I can't actually issue a SOC 2 report. I got to pay an accountant who went through accounting school, who may have no idea on anything cyber, to give me that report. That is a totally broken system. And so things like that, I think, we've just created a system where the accounting companies really can make a lot of money, and they look for what's easy to test, what's easy to show, documentation. So it now becomes more important. Hey, did you modify your security policies, which nobody reads, once a year? Because that's an easy control to test, compared to, are you patching in less than 30 days? And so that type of focus, I think, in our industry is something where I think we've been harmed by accountants, and we got to pull that leverage back a little bit more in cybersecurity.
And I'll challenge you with, how do we begin that? How do we begin that change in that way? Because let's face it, you hit it, right? Accounting firms are making a lot of money on that, and they're not going to, make that go away anytime soon. So how do we get real about, the risk perspective, as opposed to, did you guys update your policies, and did everybody, they didn't even read them. They just checked off.
Yeah. So the first thing is, I think we have to look for the right types of backgrounds in our testers, right? Because if the people doing the audits are worse than the people writing the controls, you're probably not going to find the right things. The second thing that I would also say is, we need to really figure out, what is it we want to test? And I would usually say, start with the biggest cybersecurity risk from last year, the data breaches that you found out, figure out what was the root cause, and expect more of that next year. Honestly, there's going to be some new things, but 90% of the attacks are almost the same attacks from last year. It's identity-based attacks, it's vulnerabilities on internet-facing systems, it's phishing attacks. How do we build really good, robust security systems against those types of threats that are going to come into our organization? And then that is what I really want to test around, right? And if I do that, I think I'm going to get a higher quality risk assessment than if I just check around, these things that have been listed, 10 years and it haven't really changed from the form.
What an interesting thought for testing on phishing. I would love to go to a company, show me a report of how many of your employees clicked on a fish in the last year. How would you even explain that from a customer perspective? And what metrics will we even set up around that? If you fail 3 times, you get fired. How, from an employee perspective, would that work? I would love it from a customer perspective, being able to say, Amazon, you had 50 people out of your 51 that clicked on a fish. I'm paying you less.
Yeah. And everything still has its challenges, right? So phishing examples, I can throw a phishing example where it's got all sorts of misspellings and mistakes, and make it really easy for my company to have 0% clicking. Not realistic, but certainly I can do that in order to gamify my numbers a little bit. But I think the big thing that is the problem today is, if I go and I say, okay, I want to buy this software, and then I do my third-party risk assessment, I say, send me all your internal vulnerability scans, send me all of your phishing numbers and your metrics. Companies don't want to give that today, right? Because they think it's going to make them lose the deal. And we're also going to give them work to do, right? If we see, here's 100 critical vulnerabilities, well, I need you to go fix that before I buy your product, right? And so that incentive is not aligned right now for that transparency. Their transparency is, I need an assessment that says I look good so that they buy my product, right? And I think we have to figure out what that win-win is, just like I mentioned before with, some of these financial motives to drive the right behavior.
Yeah, because I'm just thinking, from a CISO perspective and an executive perspective, how do you translate that? It goes back to the ROI of security, right? It's that is the biggest challenge we've always had in cyber. How do we translate that risk or the prevention of that to favorable dollar amount to executives? Right now, it's really easy, right? It's really easy. Here's our SOC 2. Here's the piece of paper says we passed, our report card, and then how do you then translate it? Well, geez, especially developers, talk about, software supply chain, how do you go and say, guess what, guys, you can't use that because it's just riddled with bugs and holes, and their counter is, well, we need to get the product out the door. So guess what? RevGen, product out the door, is going to take precedence and priority over, from an executive perspective, to costing us money on holding and finding the right vendor. How do we have that conversation?
Yeah, I think we have to come back and really understand what really keeps a company secure. And I don't think we have to think too hard. I mean, there's clearly some big wins right here. Like, you got to have multi-factor authentication. You got to have, an EDR on all of your endpoints, things like that. And then I think we have to say, okay, now I need to have just one level deeper behind this, right? Mm-hmm. So, okay, I have an EDR. What percentage of your endpoints have that EDR installed and running in the last 30 days? Is it 90%? Is it 99%? Something like that. That would be a really good leading indicator if you have that EDR on that machine, right? And I think you could pick just a handful of these things, like what percent of your applications use MFA? What percent of your applications use an EDR? I bet you could come up with just like less than 10 of those. And then that would be so much more powerful than asking 500 questions in a questionnaire, right?
More effective, efficient on the security staff too, right? I mean, my heart breaks whenever I talk to clients. They're like, oh my gosh, we've spent, like 80 hours on these questionnaires, and they just keep coming in, and it's like, heart goes out, and it bleeds for them right now, because that's where the deals are made, is once those questionnaires have been met. But, what you're talking about, Ross, makes me think of like the underwriting process for cyber insurance, because those are the questions that the insurance companies are asking. And in my opinion, those are really good questions. Right?
I agree. I think that's where we need to go, right? The insurance companies are running these, through their quants and other analysis to say, what are the most important things in order to be leading indicators of whether or not you're going to have a data breach, right? And I think if we take this more focus of what particular safeguards are in place and how effectively are they deployed, mm-hmm. with just those 10 tools there, or metrics around those tools, I think you're going to be in a very powerful position. And now I have a conversation. I said, hey, I looked at these 10 different metrics, and this one here kind of scares me. You only have MFA on 20% of your apps. Can you at least show me that these apps here that I'm using for your company to host my data are all MFA, or is that the challenge that I'm going to deal with? And now you have the right type of discussions without being just hammered by this noise of, 500 questions in the cake or something like that.
So I'm loving this conversation. Absolutely loving this conversation. And I think in hearing you, it made me realize, get ready. Have we overcomplicated this blessed thing? And we need to go to executives and say, listen, the whole reason why we have this whole third-party risk management program is why? Because we don't want downstream liability or upstream liability for being hacked or breached. That's what it comes down to. So why the heck are we looking at, did they meet all 120 control criteria versus are they secure? Because, fundamentally, that's what the question is, right?
Yeah, today there's only really two reasons why you do third-party risk management. One is I have a regulatory requirement to do it. Something like NYDFS says, thou shalt do vendor risk management, and you say, aye, aye, sir, and you go and do it. The second one is because my cyber insurance requires it. If I want cyber insurance and they ask for me to do it, then of course I need to do it. I don't think it really does much to lower the risk of identifying which vendors are going to lose your data and actually do that. I think anybody who's gone down that route, it just hasn't proven that way. When you analyze 2,000 companies, what is your chance of really finding the bad ones? I just haven't seen that work out in my career.
Yeah.
But I do think there's an opportunity to step back and say, we have a broken system today. The system is, I'm asking these questionnaires that are very lengthy from my vendors who have to spend a lot of hours to fill that out. They have to pay for a SOC 2 or some other report that costs at least $30,000 or more, depending on the size of their organization. And then from there, I have to spend all these hours to analyze this stuff to make sure it met my security policy requirements of my organization. We got to do away with this. This is costly for our suppliers and our vendors, which means we're going to pay more for that solution because they're going to bill it back to us. We get down to something like, here's the 10 questions. We get to a place to where we're actually financially incentivizing them each month to have good security. And when I have issues, I actually have a lever that says, I'm going to take away your $10,000 bonus for the month. Now from there, we're aligned. And I think when we start doing this over here, we get to a better solution for everyone.
So that last part is what tied it all together for me. The financial incentive, because let's face it, you need to comply with regulatory requirements. One could argue that the intention, right, goes back to the intended, what's the intention behind the controls? It was what's behind the intention of the law. These laws came about because nobody paid attention to cybersecurity or information security back in the day, right? And so they had to force companies to do the right thing. Shamefully so, but it is what it is. So I don't think we're ever going to, I don't know if you've ever tried to have a law changed. It's not an easy task. It's not going to happen. I think the monetization is more, it's a faster way to get that momentum going. So I really appreciate that. But I think that means a hit to, well, actually, it wouldn't. I was going to say a hit to the auditing firms, but the auditing firms, they still are going to have their piece of the game, right? They still are going to be doing their SOC 2s. And
yeah, today the biggest thing is if I'm a CISO, I want to shift liability away from my company. And how do I do that? I pay an accounting company to sign off a piece of paper that says, hey, we meet all the controls. I've done all the due diligence. I have met a certain level of defensible security.
mm-hmm.
And then when I have a data breach, I go in and I say, hey, I followed the law. And you know what? I even had external assessors review me and it said I look good. And so I did what I could. Was I perfect? Absolutely not. Nobody can stop every attack. Don't sue me.
Right.
That is the status quo of every large company today. And I think we have to think about that and say, is that the right focus? And is there a way where we shift that so we're actually much more threat focused, much more risk focused, instead of that CYA approach?
Right. I agree. So let's shift gears. Actually, before we do that, Cailin, we've been bouncing back and forth here. You got anything you want to add to that?
No, I'm just absorbing it.
Okay.
I know I'm giving a lot of hot takes today here. So
I love it. That's what I'm here for. That is what I live for. It's all of the hot takes.
Yeah, right. Exactly. Okay, so let's shift gears just a tiny bit. So let's talk about responsibility and accountability for this. Ross, you and I both been CISOs many times over. We know this game, obviously. We know this game. And we've done that dance with the execs and leadership, so we get it. But let's face it as well. The majority of businesses in our country, here in the States, and I'm sure internationally, are mid-sized businesses that don't necessarily have a CISO. So who should take responsibility for this whole third-party risk management?
So the first thing that I would also challenge is I don't even think CISOs truly own 100% of cybersecurity. And this comes back to, I actually really like the accounting model called the 3 lines of defense. I know I've hated on accounting so much, but they actually do really good things too. And what it says is there's certain types of controls and control owners. So think of a software developer. They write the code. So they're the first line of fixing all the code vulnerabilities. If they did it 100%, everybody else would be out of a job, right? Then you have the second line, which is some type of compliance function. Hey, we checked all of our AppSec scans. We found this system has a lot of vulnerabilities. Why didn't this developer go fix their vulnerabilities? That's the second line. That's cyber's job. And then third line is audit, to review the program, where if cyber continually shows the vulnage is getting worse and worse and worse, audit writes a finding that says, why aren't you doing anything about it, leadership team in the organization? Now in this regard, where we say, hey, who's going to own third-party risk management? I think the application, let's just say I'm using an HR application like Workday. It's probably HR's responsibility to ensure that this application serving an HR purpose meets their needs and doesn't put the organization in a harmful position, because ultimately they chose which product to buy. Now, certainly if they're smart, they're going to talk to their legal counsel, they're going to talk to their cyber counsel to say, give me your best opinion. Is this a good tool to buy before I buy it or before I renew the contract? But if you think about it this way, HR is the one who owns the third-party risk management of this product. They may, give some responsibilities out to cyber to do a quick evaluation of that product, but the accountability still lies with the HR team for an HR application. I think that's the way things should go in organizations.
So that's bringing back the good old governance model. Oh my, yeah, that's brilliant. Absolutely. And I think far too often, I don't know. I think we like the abuse too much, meaning CISOs, because, we're always the fall guy, for taking that. And when you have a mature, and it goes back to the maturity, right, of an organization and the structure, they're of a governance structure, yeah. Like even like, there were organizations I worked with where, the governance structure included, the first tier was, me, working and meeting with the product, director of product, the head of product, the CTO, and myself, and we would negotiate and come to those understandings of what the prioritization is for fixes and so on and so forth. And if that product included, some facet like HR or even finance or something, they had representation and so on and so forth. So I really like that model that you just articulated. But again, that's getting to a maturity level. I think of, like Cailin and understanding, again, because I'm her mom, understanding some of her challenges. It's like, you go do it, fix it. And she's the, and, so it's hard to get folks to realize the importance of that governance structure, because one person can't own it all. You can't do it. It's just impossible. What are your thoughts there?
Yeah, I think if we look at things like Sarbanes-Oxley, you have controls, and every control has a control owner. That is the first person responsible for ensuring 100% compliance to this control. And if you actually look at that, it follows this 3 lines of defense model, right? Cyber doesn't own control for access control. They may build SailPoint as an identity access management solution. It's whoever runs the IT application. They have to review the users once a year, once a quarter, to ensure that access control is happening. So I think when we start to look from this control type approach and say who's really responsible, this is really, really key. The other thing I think we do ourselves a disservice on in our industry is everybody's always looking for the likelihood and the impact and measuring a risk and saying why it's going to go bad. And that tends to be the stopping point. And I think that's actually the wrong thing to compare. And the reason why is if you told me there's a $10 million risk on this application, should I take it or not? I don't think we have the right context. The right context is what's the business benefit? Because if I can make $10 billion on this application and it's a $10 million risk, I'm going to go to Vegas and I'm going to throw that dice game every single day of the week. But if I'm only going to make $1 million and I'm going to lose 10 million, that's a horrible game to play. So I'd like to see us maybe step back a little bit and hold the business more accountable to saying, show me the true business benefit versus the risk, more than just only focus on the likelihood and impact of the risk.
So that goes back to the use case perspective.
Mm-hmm.
You know, kind of goes back to, right, from a PMO. You know, we have those great organizations that have a nice PMO. And when you wanted to go and start a new effort, you needed to bring forth, like, what are the resources you need? And that meant, you know, people, software, tooling, blah, 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 blah. And it would go through a full review. You had to justify, you know, the cost, the expenditure, or the use, and cyber had a piece of that to say, you know, just what you did, you know, like, okay, well, you know, you want to use this piece of software, it costs X amount of money, it's kind of risky, but not the worst, but the value, the revenue coming in from that is exponentially more. So guess what? We're going to do it.
But yeah, and then if you do that right, now you can say, hey, here's a cost of goods sold, right? We're going to say 10% or 5% on every, you know, thing that's built. That's the security tax around that.
Yes.
And I think that makes sense, right? We can start to build the safeguards in. But what happens is we don't ever actually hold the business accountable to the business benefit, which means there's no cost of goods sold and tax applied. So then we never actually fund the security around something. And if we really believed in the business benefits, we would. But we let that part of the business get away with anything. We never hold them accountable for all the bad business cases that they made in the last 3 years, which ultimately had price overruns, schedule delays, and all these terrible outcomes. And so then, like, I feel we just get in a lot more precarious situations with horrible, you know, resource expenditures and cost overruns.
You guys are like giving me some flashbacks because I literally just did like a risk or return on security investment document for my class like the other day, which talked all about this.
Put it to use. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Definitely. This is brilliant. I know, thinking back at some of my most favorite engagements, my most favorite clients, and, you know, really, you know, kick butt type of programs, we had all of those things, right? We had the accountability for justification for these applications. They had some ownership in that game. And of course, the governance structure was in place. Those, a lot of times, I think smaller organizations think we're just too small. Let's just get it done. And I think they're really hurting themselves more than if they can do it to the size appropriate for the size of the organization. What do you think about that? What would be your response, Ross, if for that organizations? We don't have time for that. We're too small. It's just too much overhead.
Yeah, there's always short-term versus long-term trade-offs. I need to build a product so this company makes money and survives through the year. If we don't survive, we're all out of a job. Security is going to get cut every single time in that type of decision. At the same time, I may build certain things that create technical debt and a lot of rework that in 2 to 3 years later, I have to pay those costs. That'd be, you know, a short-term win, but a long-term loss, right? In this kind of scenario. And I think you have to take this balanced, measured approach of how much short-term, how much long-term, so that you get the right viability for the company going forward. There's not always easy answers here. A lot of times it's lessons learned. It's, you know, talking to experts to figure out the best approach. But I do think when you balance the short term and the long term, goals of the organization, I think you're going to get a better outcome than if you only balance the short term.
I think that's sound advice. And speaking of advice, we're coming up to the close of, I can't believe, already an hour. I mean, we've been, I don't know about you, but I've been having a lot of fun having this chat. So what would be your words of advice? 3 to 5 points that you would leave with an organization that's struggling, such as, what are the words of advice do you have for Cailin, who is, struggling with the SOC 2, struggling trying to get those security questionnaires going? They're, just saying, just get it done, her leadership. They don't understand, the real value and the real risk. How does she turn it around?
So the first thing that I would do is I would challenge some of the assumptions. And I'll just give you an example. We may assume we need a SOC 2, but what if we went to all of our customers and said, how would you make the decision if I told you I actually didn't have a SOC 2? What would you want to see from me? And now they may just tell you the evidence that if you could show them that evidence that they most care about, you can save yourself the cost of a SOC 2. Now, other times you may not be able to get out of that. I understand, certain big, highly regulated places always look for these, but I think you'd be surprised just how many companies actually accept the risk of not having a SOC 2 from a small company, and now you just saved your company a lot of money. So always challenge. But the other things that I would go and say is you have to learn. And this industry is changing so much, so frequently. And the truth is you're never going to know it all. But how do you know enough people who do know what you need to know? So if I don't know about third-party risk management, how do I find the right person on LinkedIn that I could reach out to get the right advice so then I could get to the right outcome? So figure out your network, because that's your net worth. And if you do that, I think you're going to be really, really promising going forward, in addition to just spending the time to learn yourself.
Wow.
Great advice. So I actually have one last question for you, Ross. If you were to start anywhere with changing the whole system, what would be the first thing that you would implement?
I think if we're looking at this like third-party risk management, I would really go back to say, what is the minimum viable product that I have to do? The law requires me to do these 2 things. And then after that, how do I shorten my questionnaire from 500 questions to just 10 that really matter? Every time you can do those process improvements, you just win, right? Because you're not just doing one third-party risk assessment, you're probably doing 200 a year. And so if I make that process where I can shave off 5 or 10 hours during my review or my process, then you multiply those numbers together and now you see your savings. And that's the focus of a leader. The focus of a leader is to figure out every stupid and broken process in the organization and just make it leaner and meaner, right? If you do that, the organization gets better. And if you don't do that, well, you get to feel the same pain as your predecessors and it doesn't get better.
Wow. I love that last bit of advice. That's brilliant. And that goes for no matter where you are in your career, whether you're starting out or, you're a seasoned pro, look for those broken processes. That's brilliant. Whew. Well, thank you so much, Ross. It's been an absolute pleasure. I have really enjoyed this conversation. Cailin, thinking that your little mind is still spinning here. I'm sure those in our listening audience are as well. So again, thank you, Ross, so much for your valuable time. Appreciate it.
Yeah, of course. It's my pleasure. Ross Young, feel free to connect with me on LinkedIn. Also have a website called CISO Tradecraft. If anyone's ever looking for coaching or mentoring, always happy to talk more.
Can I vent to you? about all the vendors?
I think that happens at the bar more than online,
Yeah.
But we'll see.
Yeah.
Well, next CruiseCon.
Yeah. Yes.
Perfect.
Yeah. Sounds good. Okay, so again, we'll go ahead and wrap it up. Thank you again, both of you. This has been a really, really interesting conversation. Went all over the place, and as it should. So again, don't forget to subscribe. Give us a thumbs up and share the video out to your friends. Subscribe to our YouTube channel. And with that, until next time, stay secure, stay refined.
And don't be afraid to get a little bit feral.